So it's the full moon, and I thought if there was going to be any time where I would stop procrastinating and finally make this video, this would be it. This is a video on familiars, about them and how to make them. I'm going to be showing you some of their history, some examples from books of people who have worked with them, and how you can go about creating them. If you don't know what a spirit familiar is, it is a semi-conscious and semi-independent spirit created magically by a witch or occultist and programmed to perform a task. They are similar to a thought form, an elemental, or a servitor, although familiars have longer historic and folkloric basis. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. A few people that I've told about me making this video seemed pretty interested. So I have this big, several pages of just notes. So this is probably going to be a long video, and also some quotes from books. So even though it'll be long, like a lot of my other videos, it'll have a lot of information in it too. So I'll just start going through my notes. In European folklore, the cunning folk and the witches shared the owning of familiars. That was one of their things that they shared. Sometimes the familiars were normal animals, sometimes they were visible only to the witch and could have unnatural traits. Sometimes they were like a normally big animal like a horse, and then they would be condensed into a tiny little animal. So that sometimes they were normal animals, but there's still the debate on whether they were actually pets or whether they were spirits, and there was probably a mix of both because they had a folkloric basis. So the general consensus was that the familiar was fed with blood from the magician, or sometimes milk or bread. The belief was that the magician could assign a job for the familiar to do, and it would go out and perform it. One of the strangest things about the historic use of familiars is that they were often consulted and used in a very similar way to how spiritualists and mediums consult their spirit guides. The idea of having a helper on the other side is an extremely old belief and existed far prior to the spiritualist movement or the rise of New Age belief. For more information of the history and folklore of familiars, I would recommend Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe. Chapter 8 talks a lot about her interpretation of what the familiars could have been for the witches and the cunning folk, and whether or not they'd be actual animals or spirits or imaginary or both. And she also talks about how witches seemingly transformed into different types of animals a long time ago. So that's one of the most interesting parts about this book. But anyone interested in witchcraft or folk magic from Europe's past should read this book anyways. And it's been very influential in a lot of ways, not only just on folklore. Alexandrian witchcraft has a long history of making use of familiar spirits. Both Alex and Maxine Sanders, the founders of the tradition, experimented and worked with familiars. Alex had a spirit baby named Michael, and it shows how dangerous it can be to make a spirit which is semi-independent. At first it was a bad thing that he made the familiar, but eventually it matured and it actually helped him out a lot. So I have his book, his autobiography, King of the Witches. Or no, not autobiography, just biography. He didn't write it. And so for the people who haven't read this book, and for people who haven't read Firechild by Maxine Sanders, I'll just read some of it so you can get the general idea of how occultists can work with familiars today. Until now, Alex had gone into a trance only when he wished, but Michael altered that. Within the space of a few days, he stopped being a helpless baby. He created Michael as a baby, and within a few days, he stopped being a helpless baby and became a precocious nuisance. He began by invading Alex's body, taking him over so completely that when Alex came to, he would find that he had insulted old friends, flirted with their wives, and done all sorts of things he would not normally have dreamt of doing. Michael was not only too big for his boots, but too big for his host. Alex's reputation was being tarnished by the wild parties his body attended when Michael was in residence. So it was dangerous and all this bad stuff was happening because he made this familiar type spirit. So that shows the danger of creating one, how it can be risky. Here he was possessed by a devil of his own making. In addition to his taking advantage of Alex's body at will, Michael had to be bribed to give information asked of him and for which he had been created. Alex, who has frugal tastes, would recover from an involuntary trance to find he had eaten a pound of chocolate biscuits demanded by Michael in return for his information. Other familiars conjured up by the coven warned that Michael was hoarding a reservoir of power. Even the first-grade witches had noticed that as of late, when they raised the cone of power in the circle, it would be whipped away and they would have to start all over again. Finally, Alex called a meeting, cast the circle, and told Paul that Michael must be destroyed. He is obsessing me. I have no life of my own. I can't get on with any work, as I have no defense against him. In front of all the high priests and high priestesses, no first graders were allowed to witness the banishing. Alex prepared for the final act against Michael. Alex was adamant it was his life or Michael's. The experiment had not been a success, and it must be ended. Suddenly, Alex Standard dropped his athame, and Michael's voice took over, the first time it had ever done so inside a circle. I am a spirit, he screamed. I have stopped being what you made me, a familiar, and neither you nor all the gods can destroy me. So this would be terrifying to pretty much everyone. And a lot of occultists would not be prepared to handle something this serious. So that's kind of the warning before you decide to make a spirit. Make sure you're prepared to deal with it if something goes wrong and you know how to banish. And recognize that to just do it responsibly. Determined to know if that was the last of Michael, Alex conjured up the other familiars to inquire. You cannot banish him altogether, was the reply. Let us take over his training so that he may become a subservient spirit and come only when called. Alex was reluctant, but in time the familiars were proved right. Michael became the most trusted of them all. Today he will work diligently on any task set him by Alex, Paul, or even Maxine. And there are a bunch of stories from people who have written books about Alex Sanders, about how useful Michael was and how good he was and how he helped him in healing and clairvoyance and all this other stuff. So it can be that your spirit familiar just needs some time to mature, and I guess I'll show you my familiar right now. This is the vessel that my familiar lives in, and it's a iron. He's a mouse, and he's very small, so it's hard to, it would be hard for him to like wreak total havoc. But in the beginning, when I first had him, he wouldn't listen to anything I said, and eventually, after working with him and just being patient and kind of telling him that I was the boss a bunch of times, he eventually started helping me. He's still kind of lazy and useless, but he helps me with some things. Alexandrian witchcraft has a long history of making use of familiar spirits, both Alex and Maxine. Oh, okay. Maxine Sanders also worked on creating a familiar, which she describes in Chapter 8 of her autobiography, Firechild. And it is another example of the attempt to create a spirit familiar going disastrously wrong. She recounts how the familiar she made was mischievous and multiplied, filling the house and having to be banished by her and Alex. Eventually she did banish all of the little familiars that she made, but it was a big hassle. Janet and Stuart Farrer, prominent Alexandrian witches, have also made use of familiars. They created one in the form of a woman to protect seal pups from being killed by fishermen. And then heard later that people in the town saw a figure of a ghostly woman standing on the rocks in the ocean who fit the characteristics of their spirit. So it wasn't even, it was many, many people who reported, and it became like a legend in the town that there was a ghost who guarded the seals and stood on the rocks, and told ships to go away. So that just shows the power of familiars and spirits that you can create, and how powerful they can be to even manifest to people who have no knowledge of them. So my familiar that I showed you is named Milk. He's a mouse. I've programmed him to listen to my commands and do whatever I want him to, and also to help me with my readings. So I have him at my tables when I do psychic fairs, and he gives me symbols to help me out. One time I was giving a lady a reading, and he showed me 3 gold coins, and I knew it was coming from him. Usually when I get messages, it's from my guides or whatever. This time I knew it was coming from him, so he was just sitting there at my table, and then all of a sudden I got the 3 coins, and I knew that she was going to get like $300 within the next month, unexpectedly. And so that's one example of how he could be useful in my readings. He doesn't really do very much for me. That was a pretty unique example. He's kind of lazy, but it was nice to have him help me out a little. The relationship with the spirit familiar is made much easier if you're already used to communicating with spirit guides. So if you're a medium or a psychic and you already are in touch with your spirit guides and talk to them, you'll pretty easily be able to hear or see symbols or hear the voice of or receive words or messages from your spirit guide much easier. If you're not used to that kind of thing, you'll have to begin communicating with your spirit guide or your familiar spirit through a Ouija board, a pendulum, or other means. Spirit boards are very good to use because the messages are clear, and through using one with your familiar, it strengthens the bond between you and also gives strength to the familiar because you're spending time with it. If you're going to do this and contact your spirit guide, or I keep saying spirit guide, your familiar, with a Ouija board, I would create a strong circle around yourself with only you and your familiar's vessel inside, so you know it is coming from your familiar and nothing else. If you feel you're experienced enough and you can deal with the risks and you have a use for one, the next part of the video will be how I went about creating my familiar and how you could easily do it yourself. The general method of creating a familiar is using a magical process to raise energy and direct it into a condensed vessel or form. The familiars of past folklore were always kept in bottles or boxes. The vessels are very important because they create a physical place where the overlap between the spirit world and the physical world can overlap and be used by the witch or magician. This overlap is also enhanced by the feeding of your familiar with physical food, talking to your familiar, and touching and caring for the physical vessel which your spirit is linked to. This is what I first had him in, my familiar. His name is Milk, by the way, M-Y-L-K-E, and I got that from Margaret Murray's book. In one of the trial records, the accused witch was asked what her familiar was called, and she replied that it was Milk, M-Y-L-K-E. And that's probably just the old English spelling, but I liked it. So you need your vessel. Clean it physically, cleanse its energy with salt water and incense, or whatever way, smudging, sage, whatever you want to do to cleanse the energy of your vessel. Basically make it brand new. Further preparation would be to decorate it or make it in a place that really suits your familiar. So for both vessels Milk has lived in, first he lived in the box, and then I found this at an antique store and asked him if he wanted to move into it, and he was like, yeah. Both of them I rubbed them with dragon's blood and patchouli because I thought that would give it kind of energetic and also earthy vibe, so that fit the mouse idea pretty well. If your familiar was like a bird or something, dealing with air or dealing with water or something, you would want to use something that fits that, so you wouldn't want to use patchouli and dragon's blood. You'd want to find something suitable. And that just helps to kind of set the vessel aside and say that this is the kind of spirit that I want to be in this vessel. It kind of makes the whole idea stronger. So that's step one. You need the vessel, you need to cleanse it, you need to prepare it. And it can be a bottle or a box or even just an image like this. It just has to be something that physically represents your familiar. Step two is the sigil. After your vessel is prepared, you will want to make an image of the familiar. I would recommend creating a sigil for it. This is basically the same function as the vessel, but it is more specific and easier to direct energy toward. I would recommend treating the process of making the sigil the same way you would treat any magical working, so you should do it inside of a circle. Get your sheet of paper and write exactly what you want your familiar to do. So at the top you can write, for example, guard my home. I want this familiar to guard my home. Or help me with my readings, help me sleep better, get rid of my nightmares, etc. Anything you want it to do. Draw the creature with as much detail as you can beneath that. List some traits of it and its name written clearly. So you want to use all your drawing skills, shading, make it as detailed as possible so you can really get the idea of what it looks like in your mind. List some of the traits of it, write its name clearly. The name is very important because it gives you the ability to command and have power over it. So you can't really say, milk, go bring me $10 unexpectedly or something. That just an example. You can't really do that if you don't know his name. You would just be like, hey, mouse thing, go out and do this job for me. So it's very important to have the name. It's kind of like a key to it. After you have all that written down, draw a small sigil. It should have the name of the familiar and a very simplified drawing of it. So here's my sigil that I used to create milk. Might be backwards on YouTube or on the video. So it says milk right there, milk right there, milk right there, milk right there, in a square. This is a little simple swirly drawing of a mouse, and that is what I use to focus on and build energy. So when I built energy, I first did it with the box, and I had the lid off, I think, and I had the sigil propped up in there so that I could see it. So then I sent the energy directly toward the sigil, which helped me to create it in my mind, and then link it with the vessel. So a sigil is very important because the vessel doesn't really remind you of the spirit that you're trying to make unless it looks like this. But having the sigil there really helps you to concentrate. Step 3 is the actual creation of the familiar through a method of raising energy. You can focus on the sigil and chant, you can dance around it while focusing, etc. I used cord magic to create mine, and I would recommend that to most people because it's very simple. You can sit down, but it also helps you to concentrate and raise the energy exactly how you want it to. And it's also repetitive, so it puts a lot of energy into it. So within your circle, get your sigil, vessel, and cord. This is the cord that I use for most of my general magical working. It has a good thickness to it, and it's very easy to tie a knot and then untie it when you need to. It doesn't tangle easily, but if you don't have this type of cord, this is like the classic type of braided cord that Wiccan type witches have used for a long, long time. But if you don't have that and you can't go to a fabric store and get it, you can use yarn or string or any type of cord. The importance is that you can do a repetitive action and tie the knots and then untie them. Within your circle, get your sigil, vessel, and cord, and tie power into each knot. So the way I tie power into each knot when I'm doing cord magic is start out, tie it, visualizing your power being trapped inside of the knot. Then go on, tie another one, put the power inside of the knot, trap it in there. Then when you're ready to let your power go, you untie it, and as you pull the cord straight, it goes out. That's what I do for any type of cord magic that I'm working on. So that's what I would recommend you do. So when you're doing it, you have your vessel in front of you and the sigil, and then you say, "I tie power into thee," or whatever you want to say. "I tie power into thee." You go along the whole cord that you have. This one is 9 feet long, so it would make a lot of repetition since it's so long. And then when you untie it, untie each knot, visualizing the power from the knot flying into the vessel. Say, "Blessed be Milk." I would say Milk, but whatever your familiar's name is, it could be Bob or Bill or whatever. You say, "Blessed be," and put the power inside of that vessel. After you've built up energy using the cord, put both hands onto the vessel and will your power into it. So, like this, say, "I will my power into thee," and concentrate on filling it up with your power. To wrap up the building of power, say your familiar's name and that you're its boss. From the get-go, make sure that it knows you are in control. So when I made mine, when I made Milk, I said, "Milk, I am your boss. You have to listen to me. I get to tell you what to do because I created you." So be very assertive with it. Release your circle and give your familiar an offering, which further puts energy into it. You may have to repeat this several times until you can really feel that there is a presence in the vessel. When that is so, give it a simple task. So you could work on this many, many times and feel that there's not enough power into it. It depends on how used to building up power and working magic. It depends on how experienced you are with that. So for me, I only needed to do it 2 times. So maybe that's a sign that I'm good at focusing or putting power into certain things. I don't know. But for some people, it takes a very, very long time. And I would probably blame that on whatever method they're using to raise power. So since the cord magic is so repetitive, it puts a lot of power over and over again into it. So that's why I would recommend it. Once you feel kind of that you really feel like there's some type of presence there in the vessel, whatever vessel you choose, then that's when you can start feeding it. I would recommend that you feed it once or twice a month. You can use the moons of a reminder when to feed it, so you can feed it every full moon or every new moon, or you can feed it both every full moon or every new moon, or whenever you just feel that you should feed it. That's pretty much the whole process of making the familiar, and if you keep at it and you put a lot of energy into it, you can be sure that something will happen, and hopefully it'll be good so you don't have to banish it or have problems. And there are many cases where a familiar has caused a lot of problems, but there are also many cases where familiar creation goes smoothly and is a very useful tool to have. And it's been something associated with witchcraft and folk magic for many, many hundreds of years. That's basically it. Some tips for if you decide to make a familiar is be faithful to it. If you say you'll reward it for something, make sure to keep your promise. So if you say, "Milk, help me find my watch. I lost my watch. Milk, help me find it." And then all of a sudden you get a feeling, oh, maybe it's in the couch cushions or something, and you go find it and it's in the couch cushions, and you should say thank you, and you should also give it a reward. And if you said something like, "Help me find my watch and I'll give you a cookie," or something, you should give it a cookie to make sure that it's a mutual thing and you're having respect for it. Be respectful but firm. You're its boss and it must listen to you. If you act like a pansy to your familiar, it won't work and it can be mischievous. Don't be like, "Oh, it's so cute though, such a cute little familiar, I don't want to be mean to it." No, you need to tell it exactly what you want it to do, and that's your right because you created it. If you only need your familiar for one job or you're done with it, say goodbye, get rid of the vessel, do a few banishing pentagrams over the vessel, even destroy the vessel, and stop feeding it and giving it energy, and it will most likely dissipate. And if you stop putting energy and it just runs out of energy, then that's good. That's what you want to happen. The whole process of creating and working with a familiar is an advanced magical skill and can be a lot of work, but hopefully with enough patience you will have a personal and useful magical helper like occultists and magicians have had for hundreds of years. So I'm definitely glad that I made my familiar, and he doesn't help me a whole lot, but it's fun to have a simple little thing a simple little friend in the spirit world that you can communicate with. And it's very good for learning to communicate with spirit guides, because it's something that you have a stronger link to and you have an inherent link to. So it's very good to learn that way. So practicing learning with this, communicating with it through a spirit board or a pendulum, or just through your intuition, automatic writing, any type of thing that you can use to communicate or get messages from your familiar. It's really good training and practice to learn how to communicate with spirit guides, because it's basically the same principles, learning to get messages and have communication with something on the other side. And that's the end of my notes. That's the end of my long video, about 30 minutes. Hopefully people like this as much as they liked my other videos on witchcraft that I've made in the past. So have a good full moon.